Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. And I come with greetings from Silicon Valley. And I'm going to speak English. It's probably a little bit of Californian in there. So let me know if you can't understand. Sie dürften Fragen auf Deutsch stellen, wenn Sie wollen, aber I prefer to speak English. Thank you. In the past 30 years, much has changed for the better concerning women in science. And today I want to introduce to you this Gendered Innovations project that we've been working on. It's a large international collaborative project that demonstrates how gender analysis can add value to science, medicine, and engineering. But first I want to have a little bit of fun. So it's important to emphasize that in my lifetime, the situation of intellectual women has changed dramatically in the United States and in Europe. And we can measure this through images, what we in English call iconography. And if you are part of a consumer culture in either the US or Europe, you understand the power of images. So I'm going to show you 3 sets of images from 3 decades. This starts in 1980, and I think it's very important to show images like this because the gender system is very deep. And this is a composite drawing from high school students' drawing, and the high school students were asked to draw a scientist. That's all. Draw a scientist. And so the scientists brought together the image here, and you can see that 48% of the students drew a person with facial hair. So obviously a man. 63% drew a scientist with a lab coat. 26% had this little pencil protector. This is the 1980s, before you all had your iPads. And then, of course, important to us is that 92% drew males. So that's 1980. Now we come to a repeat of the Draw a Scientist contest in 1990. Now the number of men is only 70%. And of course, you see here this love for the Einstein hair. In the United States, the Einstein image is the image of science. And 16% of the students drew clearly a female image. So this is already an improvement over the 1980s. She looks a little anorexic, I think. But look at this connection to nature. The students drew little Blümchen there in the corner. But of interest is the figure F, the figure you can't read there. 14% of the images were ambiguous for sex, and the students said it's because the sex of the scientist doesn't matter. So that's very interesting. Now we come to 2008. So this is the last time that I know of that the research was repeated. And here, only 61% of the students drew males. So now we've really made some progress. We still need more, but we've made some progress. This is Harry. Harry, I take to be a chemist. He's about to explode from his laboratory. Again, we get the Einstein hair, and very actively involved in science. Now, in 2008, then 33% of the women drew, of the children, the school students drew women. And you again see this association with nature and this more just observing, not so actively engaged in science. All of this is very interesting because several years ago, a gender expert and a screenwriter from Berlin appeared in my office at Stanford, and they wanted to remake German television. They wanted to remake the image of women, they wanted to remake the image of men, and remake the image of scientists. I think this is very positive, and really to solve your problem here in Jülich, we have to go to Hollywood, and we have to go to the people who make the images that propel boys and girls into their future careers. I think that's an important part of it. So today I want to talk about the 3 basic approaches to the field of gender and science. The first one we've been working on since the 1970s, the participation of women in science, or as I like to say, let's fix the numbers of women. The second is gender bias in scientific institutions, and positively said we can fix the institutions. And then the third part that I have devoted my career to is gender in research, or fixing the knowledge. So I'm going to say a little bit about each of these approaches, and we start with the first. The first and most straightforward strategic approach focuses on increasing the number of women. At this level, government and university programs have generally attempted to fix the women. That is to say, they try to make them, or us, more competitive. Efforts in this area began in the 1970s and were spearheaded by the National Science Foundation in the United States, by the European Commission here in Europe, by individual governments, and these agencies both gathered statistics on women in the scientific and engineering workforce and provided a number of different programs for women. The idea was to jumpstart women's careers by increasing the funding to women researchers, to teach us how to negotiate, to teach us how to mentor, how to set up networks, and that sort of thing. So it's very important to support women's research. These kinds of programs are very important, but they aren't enough. And let me give you an example of how this approach is not enough. And I'll take an example from Stanford University. A couple of years ago, Stanford decided to do the next best thing for their women faculty. Whenever Stanford does something, they do it very well. And they decided that what we needed to know was how to negotiate. The idea is that women's salaries continue to be lower than men's salaries because when offered a job, women tend to say, "Oh, thank you very much. I can't believe you chose me." But when men are offered a job, they tend to say, "I can't possibly work for that amount of money. I need more." So this small wage gap that starts at the beginning of a career becomes much larger as you advance through your career. So the Stanford program was excellent, and especially the women in our medical school went back to negotiate, but they hit the same brick wall that women often hit when they try to negotiate. The problem was that the training was for women, and it wasn't for both administrators and for the women faculty. Now, if we look for a moment at the data, we find that women may be penalized more than men when initiating negotiations, and for this reason, women rationally don't initiate negotiations. One study found that 7% of the female candidates for a new job negotiated, compared to 57% of the men. So this approach, this supporting women's careers and teaching women to negotiate and that sort of thing, is very important, but it's not enough. Institutions themselves need to be transformed, and we come to the second approach: subtle gender bias in academic or research institutions. Since the 1970s, the numbers of women professors have increased dramatically, especially in the United States. And this didn't happen automatically. Many specific programs were funded by the United States National Science Foundation, and in particular, the U.S. Advance Program, founded in 2001, has provided $138 million to transform institutions. These are not grants made to individual researchers, but to an institution like the University of Michigan, some of these big public universities. And each university receives about $4 million to spend over 5 years. And the important thing is that the leadership, a university does not receive this grant unless the leadership, the president, the chancellor of the university are on board and are really involved. The goal of the government and the universities has been to reduce gender bias. Unconscious gender bias is labeled as subtle gender bias because we are unaware that we are being biased. It's unconscious behavior. I think these days people really do want to do the right thing, but many of us aren't aware of the impact of our unconscious behaviors. So stereotypes can be a problem. Stereotypes, it's important to understand how they work because they can influence hiring and promotion of faculty. They can influence the evaluation of excellence. So Jülich says you want to hire the very best, but how do you really evaluate excellence? I think this is an open question. They also influence who decides to become a scientist and an engineer. Stereotypes can influence performance. We know about the stereotype threat, that if a woman is reminded that she is a woman, she does worse on a math test than if there is no reminder, if she's not asked about her sex. Stereotypes can influence the self-assessment of aptitude, whether or not you think you're good at something. Stereotypes can influence self-assessment of competence and ultimately career selection. So if you think you're good at mathematics, you'll choose a career that is math-based. So let's look quickly at some examples of unconscious or subtle gender bias, and I'm going to give you data-driven studies. We'll start with leadership. Leadership requires a certain level of confidence and assertiveness. And in this game, women cannot win. Women who are not assertive are considered incompetent, and women who are assertive are considered unpleasant. And I call this the Hillary Clinton syndrome. If you watched our elections 4 years ago, Hillary Clinton, who's a very serious woman, started out being her serious self. And then the polls told her handlers, that she was being unpleasant. So she turned up the smiling, and you could see it as soon as she turned up the smiling. And all I have to say is she didn't win the election. So why is it important to have women included in leadership? There's a study that was published in Science magazine in 2010, and this study found that team collaboration is greatly improved by the presence of women in the group. This improved team collaboration in turn facilitates something called collective intelligence. So it makes the group work better together. There's also a value added to women in leadership, and we're having someone from McKinsey talk to us this afternoon, so I'm not going to dwell on this particular slide. But McKinsey has analyzed leadership into 9 different qualities. And what they noticed is that women have about 3 of these styles more often than men, and men have several leadership styles more often than women. And what McKinsey wants to tell us, what their study shows, is that a company that has all of these leadership styles does better, it performs better. So organizational performance is enhanced by including women in the leadership. Now, much more could be said about leadership, but let me move on to hiring. We often hear that it's hard to find good women for the job, but it's important to recognize that there are mechanisms of subtle gender bias that impede our efforts to find them. So if we look at hiring, there's a new study that found, it was published just a couple of months ago, that both men and women scientists, and I think here it's important to realize that women have these unconscious gender biases very often, as well as men. So we have to look at our own behavior. So the study found that both men and women scientists are significantly more likely to vote to hire a man applicant versus a woman applicant with the same academic record. So the study was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. This was edited by Shirley Tillman, who is the well-known molecular biologist, the president of Princeton University. It's really a top-notch study. And what they did is they gave dossiers to professors. The same piece of paper, the application, and on half of them they put the name John, and on half of them they put the name Jennifer. And both the men and women professors thought it would be much better to hire John. John was given a competence score of 4 out of 7, and he was offered a higher salary. This kind of unconscious gender bias can also extend to evaluation. And we've had a study in the United States that shows that letters of recommendation are written differently for men than for women. Now, I know you don't use letters of recommendation the same way that we do, but you do have evaluation statements, and these would be the same sort of thing. What do you say about an applicant when you're recommending them? So a recent study of letters of recommendation in chemistry and biochemistry found that these letters are written differently for men than for women. Now, when I read this study, I was hit really hard. I thought, oh, I went immediately to look at my own letters of recommendation. Do I, in fact, write them differently for the men that I support than for the women I support? And the study shows that these letters, that the letters for men applicants have more outstanding adjectives. This candidate is excellent. He's the best I've ever trained. We like to say that. This is my best student. He's superior, this sort of thing. And for the women, more often they're talking about their teaching, not their research. You have to say whether she's a nice person. So you have to say something about the personal qualities. So we need to look at our evaluations for men and women and see that they are the same. Now, the good news is that it is known how to transform institutions. Jülich does not have to start the research themselves. There's a really excellent publication that came out in 2011 from the European Commission called Structural Change in Gender Institutions. And Martina Schraudner was part of the expert group that prepared this. What I like about this publication is that it's short and that it's really to the point. And you can get through it quickly and find whatever part is good for your institution. So I recommend this very much. Now we come to level 3, to looking at how we can use gender analysis to create new knowledge. And I first want to talk about the business case for gendered innovations, why we need to look at gender in research. Gender bias built into society and research institutions can create gender bias in science and technology. And gender bias in research is expensive in terms of lives and costs, and it limits scientific creativity, excellence, and benefit to society. We know about the costs, both in terms of money and in lives. In 2010, there was a report in Science that showed that between 1997 and 2000, 10 drugs were withdrawn from the US market because of life-threatening health effects. And 8 of those showed greater severity in women. Now, any drug costs billions and billions of dollars to create. So this is really expensive. And then if you're having life-threatening health effects, this is expensive in terms of human cost. So why might that be? Because most research is done in males, whether in humans or in animals or in cells and tissues. And we have some really excellent studies on this now. My colleagues at Berkeley this was published in 2010. They took journals in 2009 in these areas, and they showed, the blue shows how often a male mouse was used, a male animal. The yellow is how often a female animal was used, and the brown is both. And you see that males were used the most except in reproduction, the area of reproduction. But what is really alarming are the gray areas, where the researchers did not report the sex of the animal. This means that if the research question changes and you want to use some kind of meta-analysis, you can't use that data at all. So it's very important to get the sex of the subject reported. This is also true for cells and tissues. One of my colleagues at Mayo Clinic prepared this study of the journals, these journals, and looking at when male subjects and female subjects were used for cells and tissues. And you see the gray, the unspecified, is huge. So we really need to be looking at the source of our tissues. Now, the business case, you can also make an important business case for public safety of why we need this research. And if we take something like the conventional seatbelt, I'm sure many of you clicked on your seatbelt to arrive here today. Hopefully you rode your bikes, but might have used your seatbelt. And we know that seatbelts don't properly fit pregnant women. And whenever there is a car crash for a pregnant woman, this can be very dangerous because the seatbelt impacts the fetus. And we know that this is a very high cause for fetal death. Now, the gendered innovations, well, I wanted to say, So it's crucially important to identify gender bias and understand how it operates in science and technology, but analysis can't stop there. Focusing on bias is not a productive strategy. So research is now shifting emphasis away from critique toward a positive program that employs gender analysis as a resource to stimulate gender-responsible basic and applied research. And this is what I call gendered innovations. And now I want to go to our website. Gendered Innovations is an ongoing project, but a lot of it is already up. Oh, it's already here. No, that's the PowerPoint. And we have a globally accessible website, so people in India can use it as well as people in Europe. And this is what we want to say. So, what is Gendered Innovations? Gendered Innovations does two things. It develops practical methods of sex and gender analysis for science, specifically for scientists and engineers, because in their training, scientists and engineers have no place in the curriculum to learn this. And we provide practical case studies as concrete illustrations of how sex and gender analysis can lead to innovation. And as I told you before, this research was done through really a unique collaboration between gender experts in the US and Europe, and then people from each of the fields that we were treating, so cardiologists and engineers and the specific experts. The European Commission provided money for workshops, and we had this really wonderful collaboration, which I think really is unique. Now, for the methods, we've distilled our methods into 11, and they're here, the flyout menu. You can just click into any of them, and they're very short and to the point. It's an effort to have a starting point for scientists and engineers who don't know anything about this area to see how would I start asking these questions. What I am going to do is show you some of the case studies. We developed a number of case studies that demonstrate how sex and gender analysis can lead to innovations. We have them in science, medicine, and health engineering. I'm going to first show you the pregnant crash test dummy because I think it's the easiest to understand, and I think it's interesting. Your job is to understand what I mean by gendered innovations. There will be a quiz after, and to understand how gender analysis works. And I hope during the discussion period, I hope that some of you can give me examples from your field of research of where looking at sex or gender has brought a new perspective. I would really like to hear about that. So let me take the example of the pregnant crash test dummy. The issue here is the safety of unborn children. The US government and European state governments require by law that pregnant women wear seatbelts. And the three-point seatbelt, sure enough, was developed in the 1950s and really hasn't changed since then. Now, the problem is that this seatbelt kills. If you have even a small accident, say it's 56 kilometers per hour, 75% of fetuses will be damaged. The seatbelt, this lap belt, rides up on the pregnant belly, and when you crash, it damages the fetus. In Europe, 6 million women are pregnant at any one time, so we really have a sizable problem on our hands. Governments and car manufacturers test the safety of seatbelts and airbags and other things, and for this they use crash test dummies. This is the very first crash test dummy that was ever developed in 1949 by the US military. And this is a very large crash test dummy. He represents the 95th percentile of men for height, and that is rightly so because this crash test dummy was used to test military jet ejector seats, and I think the pilots would be these large, impressive men at this time. So this is 1949. When crash test dummies came into the civilian population and were used for car crashing, they developed female crash test dummies, so dummies which were smaller in size. But we didn't get the important gendered innovation until 1997. This is a crash test dummy, a virtual crash test dummy where you can test the damage on the fetus. And this is Linda. She's brought to you by Volvo, a company that's very concerned with safety. So here we have the gendered innovation. We have a new idea. We need to have safety for all sectors of the population. But we still have an opportunity for a future gendered innovation. And if I were a mechanical engineer, I would drop everything and do this right now. We need to redesign the three-point seatbelt. We need a seatbelt that works for everybody, including pregnant women. Now, some private companies in the US and Australia and Europe have created a supplement to the seatbelt for pregnant women. It's a little platform that you sit on. I know the Scandinavian countries have it. It's called the Be Safe belt. So a pregnant woman can sit on it. It has a supplemental Velcro strap that goes over the bottom belt here, the lap belt, and it holds it down, you hope, in a car crash. These haven't been tested by government, so I don't recommend them. I would recommend a redesign of the whole thing. Now, in our project, that's the gendered innovation, the pregnant crash test dummy. And in our project, we then like to talk about the methods. How did one come to this insight? And I'm going to just highlight the rethinking research priorities and outcomes. In much technology, men are taken as the norm and women analyzed as an afterthought and often studied from a perspective of how they deviate from the norm. This means, importantly, that women are left out of the discovery phase. I think that's really important. So many of our devices are readapted to women retrospectively. In the automobile safety example, a crash test dummy was designed and modeled on the male body with no attention to pregnancy. And then about 50 years later, a pregnant crash test dummy was developed, but this is not yet required for automobile testing by governments. So what is the solution? If we really rethink our research priorities and look at what the social outcomes will be, we find that taking both men and women as the norm expands creativity in science and technology. From the start, devices should be designed for a broad population, and this will also ensure a broader user base. So this is both important for engineering and then also for marketability of your product. Let me demonstrate a second case study, and I'm going to take something from health and medicine, and I want to look at osteoporosis research in men. Osteoporosis has long been defined as a disease of postmenopausal women. Here is a disease where we've taken women as the norm. Why is this a problem? Because if men live to the age of 75, men suffer 1/3 of the hip fractures. And when men break their hips, they die more often than women, and no one knows why. So it is an important problem. Despite the relatively high numbers of men who suffer osteoporosis, the basic diagnostics for the disease were developed using young white women. Men were not part of the original database used to diagnose the disease. So osteoporosis is typically diagnosed when a person's bone density drops 2.5 standard deviations below the mean. And this is established using a reference group. So how do we change this? What has happened in osteoporosis? It's important, our method, rethinking concepts. Okay, why do we think of osteoporosis as a female disease when it in fact touches everyone? And when we need diagnosis and treatment for everyone. So we need to rethink our basic concepts. And then importantly for osteoporosis is our method rethinking standards and reference models. And the big breakthrough for osteoporosis came in 1997 when a male reference population was developed. So you take young males and you find out what the basic bone density is so that you can measure disease. Now, something really interesting happened when they started looking at males. The NIH, our National Institute of Health, started a very large bone study in men, and they found that men aren't the same everywhere. So there was a study of white men across cultures, and they looked at the United States and they looked at Denmark, and they found that bone densities aren't the same and that you need to have specific reference groups for different populations. Because culture also builds bones, it's not just biology, but what you eat and how much you exercise and this sort of thing strengthens your bones. Okay, so there are many gendered innovations that I could report on to you. We have some in science, health and medicine, and engineering. Just to finish, I wanted to give one last example from engineering, which is not here. How do I go back to the PowerPoint from the website? Escape is not happening. So I want to give you one last example, and that is, oh yes, thank you. And that is natural language processing. So you just click, yeah. Natural language processing is a field of computer science and linguistics that designs automated systems to understand, generate, and manipulate human language. As you know, this is very important. And I want to look specifically at machine translation, and I'm going to look at Google translation. Google is a very important company. It shapes our research. The way that their algorithms are really shaping how you think. And I know that Europeans use Google as well. I think it is the search engine of choice. But I'm going to talk about the machine translation, a subset of that. So in March 2011, I was interviewed by a Spanish newspaper. Now, I read plenty of languages, but I don't read Spanish. So I put it through Google Translate. What better to do? But I was shocked and appalled when I was referred to repeatedly as he. Professor Schiebinger, he says, he says, he says. So I found that Google Translate defaults to he. I thought, okay, let me look at Sistran, one of the European systems. And interestingly, it defaults to he or it, but none of them are using the proper she. Now, this is despite the fact that Londa is clearly a woman's name in English. It can't be anything else. And it's included in lists of names used by natural language processing. They're huge lists of names, so the machine knows what a name is. And the fact that the Spanish text includes many gender-inflected words, I'm actually told that this Spanish text is very interesting because the gender is in the verb. And so it's not as simple just ella, that you can just translate as she, but so I'm told that linguistically it's interesting. But there are plenty of markers here. I'm called a professora, that has to be feminine, and they actually call me a woman. So it's not a mystery. Now, Google prides itself in not manipulating its algorithms. You talk to Google, they have an algorithm, it returns to you what is in the corpus, or that is to say, what is on the World Wide Web, and they say there's no editorial anything in there. You get what is on the web. That is what they want to give you. So the Google translation defaults to the male pronoun because he said is more commonly found on the World Wide Web than she said. But now there's the interesting point. If we look at Ngram, another Google product, of course, we see that the ratio of he said to she said has fallen dramatically since 1968, from 4-to-1 in the 60s down to 2-to-1 in the year 2000. Now, this change in language perfectly mirrors the women's movement. It perfectly mirrors all of the governmental investment in bringing more women into science. So there's a lot that is in this change in language. You know that we've had a revolution in language. All the Germans, you use Studentinnen, and you have all these endings that you use to have inclusive language. Our newscasters all use inclusive language in television. It's something that has come about. So despite all of this, Google Translate consistently defaults to the male pronoun because this is the correct answer for the machine. And in one fell swoop, Google's algorithm wiped out 30 years of feminism, I like to say. And they didn't mean to, is the important thing. They had no idea. So what do you do with this algorithm? How do you make a machine really smart? and not just getting its machineness on, as we would say. Now, this is where gendered innovations comes in. So I identified this problem, and I have these workshops, and I brought a Google guy, and I brought also the expert in natural language processing from Stanford. And I presented this issue to them, and they had never thought about it. And so they sat back and they thought about it for a little bit, and they said, we can solve this. And they said, not only can we solve, and we expect a solution by January, and I am not at liberty to say what the solution is because the papers have to be published first, but I'm told that the solution is something that produces a better translation overall. So not only will we solve this, kind of small little problem that upsets women, but we will get a better translation overall. The Gendered Innovations project then provides methods for scientists and engineers to apply gender analysis in the design and execution of their projects. And this adds value to research. It adds value to research by ensuring excellence. If you do drug studies where you're only using a male model, that is not excellent research. It also adds value to society by making research that is more responsive to social needs. And it adds value to business by developing new ideas, patents, and technology. Now, let me conclude my remarks rather quickly by looking at policy. Policy is always important in this area. So who is the global leader in the area of gender and science policy? The NSF has very nice policies. Since 1970, there have been policies to increase the number of women. I would say we are the global leader in institutional transformation, but NSF has no policy for this knowledge piece. The European Commission has policies at level 1, policies at level 2, and I encourage you to retain your global leadership in this policy at level 3. Since 2003, the European Commission has asked that researchers, when applying for a grant, suggest in what sense sex and gender are relevant to the objectives and methodology of the project. It's very well stated. And this is part of Horizon 2020. If it passes through all of the things it has to pass through, that Article 15 promotes the gender dimension in research and innovation. So once we have understood a bit about how to do gendered innovations, how do we mainstream this type of analysis into the day-to-day work of science? First, we need to train current researchers and evaluators in gender methods. I don't know how you would do that here at Jülich, how you would go to your laboratories and start to introduce just the basics of how do you develop a gender perspective. I think it's something that we need to consider. And now that we've built the Gendered Innovation site, we will be rolling it out more, and we haven't exactly decided how to do that. So we need to train the current generation of researchers, and we need to hold the senior management accountable for developing evaluation standards that take into account proper implementation of gender analysis and research. And there are several practical ways to encourage researchers to develop a proficiency in this area, because everybody's busy, but you can develop a proficiency. So by show of hands, how many of you here evaluate grants for granting agencies? Is this not something you do here in Germany? You don't send out and evaluate grants? Okay. Yes, so granting agencies, evaluators, can require that applicants include gender methodology in their research design. It's something I think DFG has just looked into this, and the European Research Council is now looking into it. So when you are marking the proposals and deciding which to fund, this can be one criterion among the many that you're looking for. Is there an important, have they looked at the sex of the subject? Okay, that's like 101. And then can you go on to ask more interesting questions? Okay, by show of hands, how many of you here hire anybody in a scientific area? Yes, so you, when you're evaluating candidates, you can see if the candidate is properly prepared. You would be looking at many things. Can the candidate do their science well? Can they do this or that well? But another thing you can look at is, for their area, do they know the basics for these methodologies? And finally, by show of hands, how many of you are on an editorial board? So this is also a very important area. Articles should not be accepted if they have not used the proper methodologies in this particular area. Now, there are many journals in the United States, and you can find a list of them, and also Europe. You can find a list of them on our website. Journals that require that the sex of the subject be listed. So this is especially important for like cardiology journals, for all of the medical journals. It would also be important for sociology and for any place where the sex of the subject is important to the research. So these journal editorial boards have made this part of their requirements, and some of them only ask that you list the sex of the subject, and some actually ask you to analyze that data. So I think that would be a great idea. And there's not one journal that asks about gender analysis, so they haven't gone to that second step, that more complicated step, but we hope that some will. So in the United States, journals that do this are the Journal of the American College of Cardiology and Circulation, and then there's also Nature is considering adopting the sex, looking at the sex issue. So the next thing we need to do then is train the next generation in methods of sex and gender analysis. I think sex and gender analysis must be included in basic science, medicine, and engineering courses at all levels. This should, I think, enhance the pipeline. It will also enhance the number of women coming through if we have this kind of information. So let me encourage you here at Jülich to look at transforming your institutional practices, and also to begin to incorporate sex and gender analysis into research and teaching. Innovation is what makes the world tick. Gendered innovations helps to create gender equality, enhance creativity, stimulate economic and technological development, and to make research more responsive to society. As I hope I've begun to show here, gender analysis sparks creativity by offering new perspectives, sometimes posing new questions, and opening new areas to research. Can we afford to ignore such opportunities? Thank you.